Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, I am Dr. Maureen Walton, and I'll be moderating this session. I want to thank you for joining us. As a reminder, our session is being recorded, but only the presenters and moderators are visible and allowed to turn on their audio and video. You will notice on the right-hand side, you can toggle between the Q&A for the event and the Q&A for this session. If you have a question for our presenters, please type it in the Q&A for the session, and please indicate who your question is for by including the presenter's name at the beginning. Q&A will take place after all the presentations, and we encourage you to stay. However, you're also able to listen to the other great presentations that we have. Our presenters each have 10 minutes to present, and now join me in welcoming our session presenters. I will introduce everyone right now so that we won't interrupt the flow of the presentations. So first up, we have Dr. Jacqueline Schulkraut, who is an associate professor of criminal justice at the State University of New York SUNY at Oswego and the interim executive director of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Second, we have Dr. Bernadette Hull, senior research investigator with the Penn Injury Science Center, PSSC, at the University of Pennsylvania and the Philadelphia Department of Public Health's Injury Prevention Program. And third, we have Dr. Sonali Rajan, who's an associate professor in the Department of Health and Behavior Studies at Teachers College at Columbia University. Presenters, when it's your turn, please turn on your audio and video and then turn off when you're done. Okay, let's begin.
Thank you, everybody, for having me. Ironically, my affiliation and all of that, I feel bad after you just said all of that, Maureen, but I'm actually not at Oswego, just at the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium now, and I lost the interim tag. But thank you all for joining us today. My presentation will be about what we know about lockdown drills, especially in light of what the evidence says. Next, please. So one of the things that we see currently is that the practice of lockdown drills is used in 95% of more than 130,000 schools across the United States, and that's public K-12 schools. And this is a practice that became especially commonplace after the Columbine High School shooting in 1999. Interestingly, on the day of that attack, there was no formalized plan in place. However, the Columbine Review Commission credited the practice of lockdowns with saving hundreds of lives that day. Next. So one of the challenges of this space is that there's so many different options, many different protocols. The state requirements vary by state. So I'm currently in the state of New York, where our schools are required to practice 4 lockdown drills in addition to 8 fire or evacuation drills every single year. But that's, not requiring a specific protocol. We know that there is, of course, run, hide, fight, avoid, deny, defend, ALICE, the standard response protocol, and others that have popped up. And so there's all of these different choices. Next. And one of the challenges of this space is that there's very little research. So I'm going to basically be talking about my study, which is the largest study in the nation to date. But prior to our starting this project back in 2018, there were only 2 studies that were published that actually looked at the effectiveness of an actual drill or any sort of outcomes relative to participation in an actual drill. There's been some additional perceptual studies, but they're usually not run concurrent to a practice, so it tends to be a bit more retrospective. Next. And so consequently, what this all really boils down to is that we have 95% of schools in the nation doing something without actually knowing if it works, how it should work, etc. Next. And so this is kind of where we came in. I like to joke with people that if you had asked me 5 years ago if I thought I would just be able to talk incessantly about lockdown drills, I probably would have told you no. But unfortunately, I was in the right place at the right time. And so after the 2018 shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, a couple weeks after that, I ended up meeting with New York's 5th largest district, and they wanted to partner for safety. They said, look, we don't have a plan. If this happens in our schools, we don't know what to do. So we need to do something. And we've been working together ever since. Next. So to tell you a little bit about it, I work in Syracuse City School District. It is the 5th largest district in the state behind New York City schools, Buffalo, Rochester, and I believe Albany. Next. There are 30 schools ranging from pre-K all the way up to 12th grade. So we work with ones as little as 3 or 4 years old, all the way up to the 18-year-olds. And sometimes we see them all in a given day. Next. That ultimately translates into more than 21,000 students that we're serving in this research. Next. And then 4,300 employees. So that includes faculty, staff, administration, as well as embedded community partners who work within the schools. Next. And so for us, when we started this project back in 2018, we had to figure out what was the right fit for the district. And we ended up settling on the Standard Response Protocol, which is a free program from the I Love You Guys Foundation. If you're not familiar with the organization, they were founded in 2006 after the founder's daughter was killed at Platte Canyon High School in Bailey, Colorado. And the reason that we chose SRP, in addition to pretty much all of the resources being free and open source, is that in our state, schools are required to prepare for 5 functional annexes. Lockout, so anytime that there's a danger outside of the building and you want to get everybody inside. Lockdown, which is when that danger moves inside the building. Evacuate, which, as I tell kids, if you can do a fire drill, you're a pro at evacuation. Shelter, which is usually used for man-made disasters, human or weather-related disasters, or things like hazmat. And then hold, which is typically used in a medical emergency when you need to clear out the hallways. So from the perspective of the district and us, when we were trying to figure out what we wanted to use, this wasn't reinventing the wheel. It was just putting a new shinier poster on it, as well as some training. Next. So to kind of just go over the scope, I'm going to be presenting research and findings from our first 4 years in the project. We're actually in year 5 right now. So next. So in our, sorry, I'm going to back up. Do you mind backing up one slide? I apologize. So just to kind of give you guys a little bit of an overview, in the first year when we started, we did an initial survey with the principals and found out that they pretty much, everybody was doing something different in the district. So from their perspective, we were really focused in on standardizing everything. So in year 1, we did multiple drills, 2 drills, 1 pre-training and 1 post-training. We also delivered the protocol training in assembly style sessions. In year 2, we did a follow-up round of lockdown drills in conjunction with trying to implement a reunification protocol. In year 3, we did 3 more rounds of lockdown drills with minor modifications for COVID. And last year, we did all 4 of their state mandated lockdown drills in each building. Next. So to kind of get into what we found, the first thing that we looked at is perceived safety. So does going through lockdown drills impact your feelings of safety? Next. And when we looked at the students, this was only grades 6 and higher, we did find a slight decrease in their perceived safety, both at school and within these respective areas, classroom, cafeteria, and hallway. And I'm actually going to come back to why that might be in a moment. Next. We also looked at faculty and staff. So we surveyed 3,000 faculty and staff over these 3 time points, pre-test, after the first drill, before training, and then after the second drill and the training. And we found that their safety wasn't really, or perceived safety wasn't really impacted in any way, shape, or form by going through the drills. It was high and it stayed high. Next. We also asked about perceived preparedness, the idea that, you felt ready to respond to any one of those 5 emergency scenarios that that are laid out in the protocol. Next. So what we ended up finding with students is that they felt exponentially more prepared to respond to an emergency after going through the training. So all 5 scenarios: lockout, lockdown, evacuate, shelter, and hold. And when we thought about this in the context of the perceived safety, one of the things that we looked at and are currently testing for is this idea of protection motivation theory, that in order for people to engage in protective behavior, they have to perceive some type of risk or danger to themselves. Otherwise, they're going to just be complacent. Now, that doesn't have to be very great in terms of the amount of danger. We don't have to simulate a shooting situation to get them to practice. We used trauma-informed approaches, but there still has to be some type of trade-off to get people to engage. Next. We also found that faculty and staff felt significantly more prepared to respond in each of those 5 scenarios. What was particularly interesting in this case is when we disaggregated based on the role, we found that staff who weren't regularly participating in the drills when we started, they would keep working through. They actually felt more prepared to respond in all 5 scenarios, whereas the teachers who were regularly doing those 4 lockdown drills and 8 evacuation drills only felt significantly more prepared to respond after the training to the 3 scenarios they didn't know how to respond to previously. So lockout, shelter, and hold. Next. We also just did a couple of other, we looked at a couple of other things next. So one of those things is fear of harm. So do you feel more afraid of being harmed at school or on the way to or from school? We actually found that after going through lockdown drills and training, students felt less fearful rather than more fearful. Next. We also found that their perception of risk was lower. So we asked them just one direct question about whether they thought a school shooting like Parkland could happen at their school. And they, again, even going through these practices that are historically centered on active shooter situations, they still perceived a lower risk after participating in drills than beforehand. Next, we did find that avoidance actually increased over that first year, particularly as we got later into the year. Research tends to support that, so we can't necessarily say it is or is not the drills. Next. And one other thing that we looked at was the effectiveness of the drills. So when we would go through, we would check for, are the doors locked? Are the lights off? Are you out of sight, meaning that we can't see or hear you? We would do a gentle knock at the door to find out if they would respond. And then we would check for vacancy. Next. And so here we're looking at locks. As you can see, percentage of door locks is high and was always high. Next. The lights, we were very low. We're about half of the rooms in the first drill, and then we're at almost 100% in terms of compliance. Next, out of sight, I will say we should caution with year 3, that was during the pandemic, so there was about half as many students. So we went from about, again, half the rooms to about 90% of the rooms, and we're talking about 1,600 occupied rooms at any given moment that are maintaining silence. Next. And then this one was the one that kind of kept me up, which was door knocks. In our first drill, like 1 out of every 3 rooms answered the door knocks, and now it's usually just a one-off. Next. So last thing that we looked at was perfect checks, how many rooms were getting all 4 steps correct. So in the beginning, it was 1 out of every 4 rooms, and now we're running 82% district-wide. We've had 2 schools get 100% across like all rooms, which was really amazing. Next. So just some concluding thoughts. We have looked at anxiety and well-being next. And we did find, it was in a neighboring district, we actually found that anxiety was lower and well-being higher after the end of the drill. So just to kind of summarize, I'm just going to, because I ran out of time, I apologize. One of the things that if you want to kind of move to the end of my slides, just for key takeaways, it's really important to identify those improvement areas, making sure that you are coming up with backup plans. So that way, if something doesn't work, you know how to do it, drilling it in convenient times like lunch, and then making sure to always assess the drills and provide feedback. So thank you guys so much for your time. And I apologize for running a little bit long, and thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending today. I'm Bernadette Hull with the Penn Injury Science Center, and today I'm going to talk to you about the qualitative portion of some of the work that we did in Philadelphia a few years back around context for school violence and a current project that we're getting up and running. Next slide. I'd like to acknowledge that that this work was supported by the NIJ, and the PI for the main project was Doug Lieb, and here are some other additional collaborators. Next. So I'll do a brief background to frame our orientation. When we talk about school violence, it includes violence in the school building, on the school property, but also importantly for us, on our way to and from school and school events. You certainly wouldn't know it from the news these days, but school-associated violent deaths still remain relatively rare, thank goodness, very devastating, but they only account for about 2% of school-age youth homicides that are occurring annually. In general, though, school violence and community gun violence remain a very high burden for our students and our communities. And almost a quarter of high school students report being in a physical fight in the past year. We know these experiences are disruptive to the educational environment and can result in negative consequences to mental health, school performance, delinquency, and injury. And we know that after every shooting that receives media attention, there's this debate. How do we fix it? The discussion inevitably includes things like target hardening strategies that fortify schools through physical design. And these strategies, like metal detectors and cameras, seek to deny access, delay the act, detect the crime, and to some extent deter the attack, but doesn't necessarily take what we traditionally do as a public health approach and focus on risk factors and addressing those risk factors. Next slide. So we set out to better understand locations and times when students are vulnerable as they proceed through their school day and their daily routine to identify opportunities for more targeted evidence-based prevention. The overall goal of the larger study was to study exposure variables at two levels, the individual and the level of the environment, thinking about things like things adolescents do and the places they go that affect their likelihood of becoming a victim. Next slide. While the quantitative study focused on identifying risk factors, risk and protective factors using a case time control design and analyzing data path points for each student's activities, the qualitative portion really used the transcripts of the students' interviews to contextualize the role of people and places and policies in this experience alongside of the physical characteristics. Next slide. The context for this study is Philadelphia. Quick stats about Philadelphia. It's the 8th largest school district in the US. At the time when we conducted the study, and the enrollment, not including charter and private schools, is about 135,000 students. At the time, about 16,000 violent crime incidents were reported in the city. That's about 10 per 1,000 residents. And at that same time period, there were about 5,500 incidents reported to the Office of Schools Safe Schools Advocate, and the majority of which were things like assaults and disorderly conduct. We know that violence in the city of Philadelphia, as is in other places, is concentrated in certain neighborhoods that as well as is experienced by students who go to the schools in these neighborhoods. And so essentially the breakdown of our students in the school district are 100% eligible for free and reduced price lunch. More than 18,000 students have IEPs. Over 13,000 students reside in homes where they speak one of 166 different languages. So very diverse schools and predominantly under-resourced. Next slide. For our study, students 12 to 18 were eligible if they lived in Philadelphia, went to school in Philadelphia, and had experienced a violent school-related assault in the 6 months prior to an interview. Staff verbally administered various standardized questionnaires, but also interviewed participants to walk them through their day that they were assaulted, to create activity paths, and talking about things with regard to their assault from the time that they woke up to the point of injury, prompting about presence of factors in the environment, illicit substances, weapons, feelings of safety, etc. We audio recorded, transcribed, and de-identified the interviews and used in vivo for coding and established a modified grounded theory approach to develop a code book and match the themes. Next slide. Of the 63 participants that we interviewed, the median age was 14, more than half were male, 3/4 identified as Black or African American, about 11% Hispanic. With regard to injury characteristics, about 20% were blunt trauma, 13% had a concussion, most reported unspecified injuries. Most, I should say, 40% considered their situation random when asked if it was a random event. They said almost half were non-gang related, and about half occurred inside the school, the other half outside. So here are the themes that we identified from the analysis. Infrequently, violence was a random act. It usually had a precipitating event. There were important contributors to violence that included social media, peers, and adults. There were important opportunities to intervene. Attitudes towards school supervision varied, and importantly, whether they encouraged or discouraged fighting. Violence was felt as normal. Students felt safe regardless of the high levels of violence, and trauma and emotion regulation played an important role. Next slide. So talking about the location, within the schools, hallways, classrooms, gyms, cafeterias are all noted as fighting locations. Conflicts that had been building between students would typically result in a fight when they saw each other in places like the hallway or the cafeteria. Gyms and classrooms were more in the moment fights, and there were physical characteristics that seemed to contribute to the location of choice. So for example, in the middle, the student says with regard to the hallway, in the middle it's skinny, so right here it's a skinny part, fights happen here. It's harder to get out, can't get away. Outside of the schools, fights occurred at places like transit stops and street corners, and those places were usually chosen because they didn't think that they would get in trouble because it was out of the view or reach of an adult. Off-site physical characteristics also contributed, things like being on a platform away from any adult being able to access them during a fight, or one student actually slipped on a mopped floor at the train station and was caught by a person he was running away from. Next slide. Despite some instances of support, peers were more likely to contribute to fighting in a negative way, either by egging fights on or joining in. In one case, the gathering around a fight prevented a teacher from breaking it up. It was common for students to share that others joined in on their fight, even noting it was expected for friends to join in and defend them. And then importantly, social media was used as a platform to start arguments, plan fighting, and exacerbate problems. Aggressive behaviors included blocking someone, instigating a fight, excluding them from a group. But in the aftermath of the incidents, videos would also be posted and creating further issues. Next slide. Since violence really wasn't random, even though students thought that it was, there were many precipitating events. There were several opportunities to intervene. So for example, some students spoke of verbal arguments that occurred prior to the physical altercation. These occurred inside a class or lunchroom where others were actually present and presented opportunities for bystander intervention or de-escalation. Next slide. Students also described situations in which they perceived adults' attitudes or behaviors being encouraging or discouraging of violence. Adults would react from fighting that ranged from doing absolutely nothing to actively intervening to actually addressing the underlying problem. A few students noted that certain counselors would help them to resolve their problems or blow off steam when they were angry. And they really appreciated that, where there were others that basically, for example, one participant described in the classroom, his teacher said that the students in the beginning of the school year, if you're going to fight, break it up yourselves because I won't. Next slide. Students expressed that they felt safe in their neighborhood, almost every single one of them. And the one exception, the one student, despite having been in a fight, that said that they didn't feel safe, attributed it to being a fight that was out of the blue. Next slide. And finally, most students we interviewed went to schools in high crime neighborhoods, lowest income, and expressed instances of severe past trauma. And it was apparent that the chronic stress and unattended trauma often prohibited students from responding to conflicts with anything other than physical fighting. Next slide. So this is just a reiteration for my time is up, but I do want to skip to the next slide and say that we are experiencing in Philadelphia similar increases to gun violence as in other spaces. And over the last couple of years, it has drawn the attention of everyone, including our school district. Next slide. And in response to these issues, the school district has proposed 5 key areas. And one of those areas is the Safe Paths program, for which we recently got a grant to expand the program based on the model out of Chicago, where there are trusted adults along the pathways for students to keep them safe. But the enhancements to the program to address more severe incidents of gun violence include combining these Safe Path programs with our street outreach teams and more coordinated communication between violence intervention and prevention. And we're hoping that that will be successful to intervene in more serious incidents of school violence that are occurring around the city. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm Sonali Rajan, and I'm a faculty in the Department of Health and Behavior Studies at Teachers College, Columbia University, and I also have a faculty appointment in the Epidemiology Department in the School of Public Health. Next slide, please. I share that to say that my work really sits at the intersection of health and education, and I'm so honored to be here today to see all of you and to be able to speak, particularly after hearing both Drs. Hole and Dr. Schildkraut speak, because I think my work doesn't sort of brings together a lot of what they were speaking about so beautifully. So I like to start talking about and thinking about school violence prevention in the context of what schools have the potential to be. And I love this quote from a piece that Tayek and Cuban wrote in 1995, where they referred to schools as having the possibility to be visionary spaces shaped by the experiences of children. Next slide, please. But more than 25 years later, as we all know, and alongside the rise of a multi-billion-dollar school security industry, it's actually the persistence of intentional gun violence that overwhelmingly shapes many aspects of our school, everything from our safety policies, our disciplinary strategies, the physical layout of a school, and its budget. And I firmly believe that we can do better. Next slide, please. I'm sure we've all seen versions of these statistics before, and I'm not going to read all of them out, but tragically, school gun violence persists as a public health crisis here in the US. On an NIH-funded study that I'm currently co-leading with Charlie Brannis here at Columbia, we've documented close to 300 incidents of intentional school shootings in K-12 public schools since 2015. And this is a crisis that has just continued to increase over the past few years. It's also gotten worse since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we all know, gun violence is now the leading cause of death among children and teens in the US. I also, in my work, and I think it's really important to consider the indirect experiences of gun violence that many children have across the US, including hearing gunshots, surviving school shootings, witnessing gunfire, having a friend or family or loved one die from gun violence. So the scope of the gun violence problem is actually much bigger than simply those who are shot and killed, but it also involves all these other experiences that do have very specific and detrimental impacts on children, on their health, on their well-being, and also on their ability to learn. Next slide, please. As we heard, and as we've heard before, and I'll go over this very briefly, but understandably, right, in response to this kind of violence, and schools across the US have implemented, at this point, we have a documented list of about 28 or 29 very commonly implemented school safety strategies as a way to secure their buildings and prepare their communities for the possibility of this kind of gunfire on school grounds. Dr. Schildkraut's wonderful work on lockdown drills is one of the very few school safety strategies that actually has a rigorous evidence base behind it. Most of the other school security tactics, arming teachers, increased police presence, metal detectors, many of these have absolutely no evidence guiding their effectiveness, or the evidence is actually very conflicting. And this is problematic for lots of reasons. We are spending a great portion of our public school budgets on safety strategies that don't have a lot of data informing their efficacy, both on deterring intentional school shootings, nor actually reducing the lethality of a shooting in the moment of. And this is significant because there are over 90,000 K-12 schools here in the US, and they serve about 51 million school children. So we need to think about where is the evidence base and how do we build upon that to really help thoughtfully improve what a school safety framework could and should look like for schools across the nation. Next slide, please. Now, I think, and this sort of ties back to how I think about schools and what their possibility is that the goal of schools is not just so much for them to be safe and spaces, not just safe spaces free from gun violence, but that schools should be places where children have the opportunity to thrive. And so in that, what I want to just spend my few minutes here today with you is just talking through a school gun violence prevention framework that my colleagues and I recently published, and that talks through how we could, as a society, shift our emphasis away from a primary reliance on strategies intended to react to school shootings in the moment of a violent act, and instead broaden what we consider prevention to actually consider attending to the root causes of gun violence well before a student chooses to bring a firearm to school with the intent to harm themselves or someone else. And I think about this as really an opportunity to reimagine the prevention of school gun violence as an opportunity to also invest meaningfully in schools, in their surrounding communities, and by extension, our kids. Next slide, please. So the work that we have been doing really talks and draws on two primary models. One is this, some of you may know this, the circle, blue and yellow circle here is the whole school, whole community, whole child model, which really speaks to the role of the community and school environments in needing to work together and be coordinated in their policies and processes and practices to ensure that school is a space where every child is healthy, safe, challenged, supported, and engaged. And so that framework and that thinking really guides how my colleagues and I think about this work. I also have on here just to the left are the way in which in public health, good public health, we think about prevention, which is putting most of our resources and efforts into meaningful primary prevention, and then less so into the secondary and tertiary. And right now here in the US, and this is not specific to gun violence, we see this in the context of many other public health issues, COVID being a nice example of that, not nice example, but a example of that, where we tend to have a flipped over pyramid. We tend to spend a lot of money and time and resources on the tertiary. We tend to react and do less to prevent. So I would like us to flip that in our thinking. Next slide, please. So I could spend like hours talking to you all about what this framework looks like, but I did just for the purposes of this, I wanted to highlight the key takeaways of what prevention could and should look like. And that requires community level investments, fundamental changes to the school environment, access to early interventions, and efforts to respond to PTSD and the following a shooting, whether that shooting happens before, during, or outside of schools, and then also a commitment to trauma-informed schools. As I noted earlier, primary prevention really involves coordinated efforts that address upstream drivers of intentional school gun violence. And so what we are talking about here in our work and really trying to advocate is that in addition to preparing kids and teachers and school staff to be ready in the moment of a violent act, as we heard discussed a little bit earlier, which is certainly very important, we also want to invest in our communities. And so in our work, we talked through a number of fundamental investments in basic community structures, access to green space, affordable housing, public libraries, jobs-based jobs programs for teens that really allow them to help break cycles of disenfranchisement. There's a number of things we could do to really reduce the rates of gun violence in our communities while also attending to the well-being of children and their families. If we couple that then with school level interventions, this could include universal school-based violence prevention programming, prioritizing positive school climate indicators, using restorative justice oriented conflict resolution practices, removing punitive disciplinary policy, sorry, say that 10 times fast. Those kinds of strategies together can really change and decriminalize the school environment and also make safer the community environment, thereby contributing to overall well-being. All of this coupled with very reasonable evidence-informed gun safety regulations, including raising the minimum age to 21 to purchase certain types of firearms, child access prevention laws, promoting safe storage practices, so really working closely with families who own firearms to encourage families to store guns safely and securely. These are all reasonable things that we can do and making sure that we reduce the likelihood of these kinds of events. We do all this also then with an attention to really supporting children in the aftermath of this kind of violence and making a commitment towards trauma-informed schools. Next slide, please. I'll just end on this note by saying that we just saw, as we know, tragically another mass shooting earlier this week. Something that's been really sticking and sitting with me in the last couple of days is that many of the students at MSU who survived this shooting on Monday. We're also students at Oxford High School, about an hour and 20-minute drive from the MSU campus, and they survived that shooting about 14 months ago. So now we're at a point where we do see, and these are kids experiencing multiple school shootings. So the ways in which we think about prevention have to get at the root causes, support them during, and then also after these kinds of events. Thanks so much.
I want to send a thank you to all three of our presenters today for this really informative presentations on this clearly topic. So if the presenters could turn your cameras back on, we have a very brief Q&A session here, and then we'll wrap up. So the first question I see here has to do with Dr. Schulkraut, and that is, are drills announced beforehand or unannounced? And what are best practices to ensure lockdown drills are being conducted in a trauma-informed manner?
Great questions. Thank you. So for our particular research, because we want to ensure that people are responding as they would and not how they think we want them to, or, we don't want them to necessarily know that we're coming. So our drills are never unannounced, but they are always unscheduled. So the school doesn't know when my team and I are coming, but the drills are always called as drills. And that is like the number one best practice. We never want to have students or staff thinking that practices are real world events, because then you have kids who are texting their parents that they're going to die and all of these other things, and it creates so much additional trauma. So every time that we go in, the drill is always called as a drill, which is really important. Other ways in which drills can be trauma informed, it's very important that you don't use any sensorial techniques. So things like sounds of simulated gunfire, mock shooters, crisis actors covered in fake blood, basically all of the things that make drills get a bad name in the media. None of those things should be done. The reality is that we don't set schools on fire to practice a fire drill, so we don't need to simulate an active shooting situation to practice a lockdown drill. It's also incredibly important that adults model calm behavior. And I find in my work that this is really one of the most challenging things, because you're dealing with two very divergent mindsets, right? If you talk to kids today, they don't know a world without active shooter or lockdown drills within that space. Whereas a lot of the adults in the room, they know what it's like to not have to do these practices. And so a lot of the anxiety really is actually coming from the adults and then manifesting into the kids. So if you're calm and you're, just practicing calmly, the kids will kind of stay down here. Whereas if you start elevating your anxiety, your stress, your just overall persona, they don't feel safe, because the person who's there to keep them safe is anxiety ridden. And then finally, one of the things that we use, and we found this to be so beneficial, is debriefing. It's really not reasonable to have kids go sit in the corner in the dark and then tell them to go right back to learning. So we always incorporate a debrief period, so that way they can talk about what they just experienced, ask questions, all of these different things, and sort of have that exhale moment before learning resumes.
Thank you. That was extremely important points that you brought up there clearly. The next question is for Dr. Hull. Tell us, do your projects incorporate community stakeholders, and if so, how?
Yeah, importantly, since we're dealing with community violence and knowledge of the lived experience, we always ensure that when we're looking at interventions, we defer to the people with the lived experience first to really tell us what works and what doesn't work and why it works and how it should work. And then we team and partner with them to create an acceptable approach to the violence prevention work.
That makes sense. Thank you. And our last question, and I'm sorry, there's more in the chat we won't have time to get to, but Dr. Rajan, what about the role of parents and families in reducing school gun violence? And there's also a similar question in the chat about that.
Yeah, they're absolutely a part of it. And I wish I had more time with all of you to kind of go through these components in greater detail. I think the primary takeaway is that I would love for us to think about the prevention of school gun violence in a really comprehensive way, very similar to how we think about the prevention of, for example, drinking and driving. So there's no one solution. It's that there's lots of pieces working together, from really kind of like like an ecological model approach, but from policy all the way down through communities, schools, individuals and their families and parents. There is absolutely a role for parents. I mentioned the safe storage component. I think behavioral threat assessment as a tool is very well documented to have, to be very effective as a strategy that schools can use in conjunction with families. Even the role of siblings in providing support for children who might be at particular risk after a shooting, for example, in terms of struggling with specific mental health concerns, which would be very understandable. And then also connecting, how do we connect families to comprehensive mental health resources that are truly accessible? I think that's really important. I think we talk a lot about, we haven't really done anything to prevent gun violence, and we also don't do anything to support these kids and their families in the aftermath of gun violence. So I often sort of am sitting here wondering, what are we doing? And I would love to see us have more conversations. So 100%, I think the role of parents and families is really, really critical.
Thank you very much. I feel like we could keep going with this session a lot longer. There's clearly a lot to address here. So unfortunately, I think we're at time, and so we're a little over time. We need to wrap up. I want to thank everyone so much for joining this session. You will receive an evaluation survey within the next few days. We really encourage you to fill that out. We're always looking to improve and grow, and our events in future years. Please also fill out the survey to receive continuing education credits. If you're not a member of the Injury Prevention Center at the University of Michigan, please go to our website at injurycenter.umich.edu to become one and get access to our monthly newsletter, publications, updates, and events. All of our sessions are recorded and will be available on our website in the coming weeks. I want to send a special thank you to our speakers and also to all the participants who attended today. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.